Hey guys, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. As we get deeper into the spring hunting season, I'm getting more and more excited for bear hunting. Those sleepy bears are beginning to wake up, check the weather, stretch their legs, and look for food, which is what we're going to talk about today. What black bears eat, and how to identify potential food sources. When you start learning about how to hunt black bears, one phrase you'll hear over and over again is find the food, find the bears. And this is a good mantra because bears are ruled by their stomachs. Now, all animals are ruled by their stomachs to some degree, but bears have a particular challenge that other animals don't. And that's their long winter nap. Between the months of October and April, bears crawl into a den and hibernate. And during that time, they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't defecate, urinate, nothing. So 4 to 7 months out of the year, bears aren't eating any food at all. And that means they have to get all their calories in a much shorter time frame than other animals. So they wake up in the spring, start eating, gain as much weight as possible before the snow comes, and then have to rely on their fat stores to sustain them throughout the winter hibernation. By the way, some people argue it's not true hibernation. They call it torpor instead, but it's not really important for the purposes of this podcast. In the context of an abbreviated feeding time frame, the mantra, find the food, find the bears, makes perfect sense. Bears are eating machines, and storing fat for the winter is their first priority. But all this begs the question, what do bears even eat? And how do you actually find the food sources in the first place? So today we're going to do a deep dive on the bear buffet, what's on the menu, and how to find and identify food sources so you can find more bears. Before we get into it, if you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to rate it 5 stars on whatever platform you listen on. Also, hit follow, send an episode to a friend, leave a review. All these things will help the podcast grow and in turn, help more people get outside and into hunting. So with that, let's get into our topic for today. Black bears are omnivores, which means they can eat plants and animals and everything in between. And we're focusing on black bears today because they're the most commonly hunted bears. A lot of these plants and foods that black bears eat will also apply to grizzly bears. But for the purpose of this podcast, we're talking about black bears specifically. A black bear's diet is composed of 80 to 90% plant matter. When I saw this percentage, I was surprised. I would have assumed that black bears were more carnivorous and ate a lot more meat. And I used to think that they were hunters just like mountain lions and wolves. But it turns out that most of their time eating is spent eating vegetation and plants. So there's all sorts of plants that they will eat. And we'll go through some of them and I'll give you some specific examples. So the first type of plants they will eat are leaves and vegetation. This includes all types of grasses, dandelions, skunk cabbage, clover, wild lettuce, that's prickly lettuce. It's like kind of like a weed that grows in your yard. Aspen leaves, beech leaves, cattails, wild calla, jewelweed, yucca in some places where yucca grows, water lilies, ferns, horsetail, dogwood, the list goes on. But they eat quite a wide variety of plants. And it really is quite surprising what they can choke down. A lot of those things I feel like humans wouldn't want to eat, but bears for whatever reason, are able to eat those and subsist off those. Especially important is that grass, especially in the spring. Bears wake up and start munching on that grass, and it helps kickstart their digestive system. And that's one thing you'll hear hunters talk about all the time, is looking for that green grass. Now, bears also eat flowers and buds. So they will eat all types of wildflowers. They'll eat aspen buds, glacier lily, willow catkins, all sorts of little fresh new flowers and buds. They will also eat roots and tubers. So sweet vetch, cattail roots, water parsnip. Those are a couple examples of roots that they will dig up and munch on. Just as important as the leaves and vegetation in the early spring is the hard and soft mast in the later summer and the fall. Mast is just a name for the fruits and nuts that trees and bushes make. So a hard mast is going to be the nuts, and soft mast is going to be the berries and fruits. So some examples of hard mast that bears will eat are acorns, hazelnuts, hickory nuts, pine nuts, pecans, walnuts, and chestnuts. Some examples of soft mast, they're kind of split into two categories, the berries and the fruits. There's apples, pears, persimmons, anything that grows in an orchard, and then there's berries. And the joke about berries is that bear is in the name. They love their berries. So there's huckleberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, devil's club berries, service berries, chokeberries, wild cherries, pokeberries, dogwood berry, currants, anything that has berry in the name or is a berry, bears likely can eat it. Now, surprisingly, it doesn't stop there. Bears can also eat grains and crops. So in places with agricultural lands, bears may eat wheat, they may eat corn, they may eat beans, any big crops a bear can come and put the herding on. And then finally, as if that wasn't enough, bears can even eat the bark of trees. And it's not their preferred food, but in the spring, when the sap is rising from the roots back into the leaves, the bears will strip away the bark of young trees, trying to get to that cambium or sapwood layer. And in the spring, it will be rich in sugars and carbs, and they can eat that and get some of that basically liquid nutrition from the sapwood. It's kind of like us tapping a maple tree to get that maple sap. But they will just go and eat hemlock trees, Douglas fir trees, big leaf maple trees. They can eat all sorts of trees, and it's kind of a surprising food source. Like I said, 80 to 90% of the black bear's diet is plant-based, but the other 10 to 20% does come from animal sources. And so now you think, okay, this is where they're hunting, this is where they're eating deer and elk and whatever else they eat. Well, surprisingly, quite a bit of their animal protein actually comes from insects. It's one of their main protein sources. So bears will eat ants, they'll eat termites, beetles, moths, even bees and wasps. They can actually eat bees and wasps, and because of their thick coat of fur, they're not susceptible to stinging on the body, though they may still be susceptible to getting stung in the face. But they will eat bees and wasps. And what they like even more than adult insects is larvae. So they will often raid nests looking for those little grubs that are rich in fat and protein and are pretty much helpless, can't get away from them. And that's a special treat for bears. Bears have a reputation of loving honey, probably because of Winnie the Pooh, right? But when they're raiding nests, honey actually isn't the main goal. They're actually raiding a bee's nest for all those larvae. And so they'll usually be raiding it during a time of year when there's little grubs in there that they can eat up. And then the honey is actually just a little extra reward. When black bears have the chance, they of course will eat meat. But they're not the best hunters when compared to mountain lions or wolves. They're really not adept at killing other animals, especially full-grown animals. So if they are hunting, they will likely be picking up calves and fawns during the spring, the smaller animals that are less able to protect themselves, or picking off weak animals or injured animals. And they'll especially eat carrion and animals that they find already dead. Sometimes they will push wolves or mountain lions off a kill and steal their food, but they're not doing a whole lot of their own hunting. Other food sources, other meat or animal food sources are eggs when they can find them, and then in certain parts of their range, fish, especially up in Alaska where fish are plentiful. They will eat a lot of fish. And just depending on the region, bears grow to different sizes based on how much food availability there is. So black bears in Alaska often will grow a lot bigger because they have those fish to feast on, whereas black bears in Idaho, for example, are living in the Rocky Mountain area and they don't have as much food availability, or at least those protein and fat rich resources. So that's an overview with some specific examples of all the foods that bears eat. And at this point, you may be thinking, holy cow, bears eat absolutely everything. How is it even possible to find the food if they can eat almost anything? All of a sudden, that saying doesn't seem very helpful, right? The funny one to me is bark. If bears can survive eating bark and you're hunting timberlands, how are you supposed to find them if they could just be munching on trees somewhere? Thankfully, there are a few things that can help us narrow it down. So first of all, bears have short, inefficient digestive systems. Despite eating mostly plants, their digestive systems are more like that of a carnivore, and it's more adept at digesting meat, which is very easy to digest. It's very nutrient dense, right? Some animals that eat lots of plants, like deer or cows, they have multiple chambers in their stomach, they have long digestive systems, and they can break down plants and get every last bit of nutrition out of those plants. But bears aren't that way. Their digestive systems are actually pretty inefficient. So with this in mind, they always prioritize easy to digest foods and the foods with the highest nutritional content. They can't digest cellulose. So when a plant grows and matures, it creates more cellulose in the plant walls to create rigidity. But a bear can't digest that in a plant. So what it does is it targets the plants that are young, the sprouts, the buds, the flowers, all the delicate young parts of the plant. And that way it can get the nutrition from the plant before it's developed that extra cellulose, which it can't digest. If you're familiar with eating spinach, or if you think of bean sprouts, this makes sense. So if you've ever had baby spinach, it's kind of soft, it's small, it's a little bit of a light green, and it doesn't taste as offensive as adult spinach. Adult spinach is more fibrous, it's a darker green, it just doesn't taste as good. If you think of bean sprouts, it's the same way. You can have this little bean sprout and it's soft and succulent, but you wouldn't just try to munch on a whole bean plant, right? It wouldn't make sense. So bears are always keying in on those young, succulent plants. And these young plants actually have a higher nutritional content than mature plants or even seeds. So again, if you've heard people talk about eating sprouted seeds for health purposes, there's actually some truth to that because they have a higher nutritional value than just the seed or even the mature plant. So with this in mind, it makes it a little bit easier to figure out what the bear is going to target. Because if they have the option between eating, let's say, tree bark or eating young succulent grass, they're always going to eat the young succulent grass first. They're not going to prefer the thing that's hard to digest, even if they could eat it. So bears are really masters of seasonal eating. If bears were in polite society, they'd be at the farmer's market all the time. Once you start to understand how bears eat seasonally, you can start to narrow down their incredibly diverse menu. So for example, in the early spring, grass and veggies are going to be their preferred food sources. And this is because they're just waking up, they haven't digested or defecated or anything for their whole hibernation period, and they actually build up a plug in their digestive system that they need to pass to get their digestive system going. So they get up, and at this time, there aren't going to be a lot of calves and fawns. It may be cold, so there may not be lots of plentiful insects. But what there is spring green up, all that green grass and all that vegetation that's responding to the rain and starting to grow. So a bear just out of hibernation is going to look for that green grass and they're going to start grazing. And that grass, that roughage, will actually help them pass that plug and start their digestive system. And they'll also get the nutrients from all these young grasses and veggies. Now, as the spring progresses, a new food source becomes available because deer and elk drop their fawns and calves. And it depends regionally how many deer and elk there are, and it may not be a major food source, but it is a welcome snack for bears, and they get a little bit extra protein. And while they're still eating those grasses and plants, they can also get some extra protein from these helpless fawns and calves. When the summer rolls around, there becomes more berries and insects available. Some berries, like service berries, which are also known as June berries, are going to ripen earlier in the summer, while other ones are going to ripen later, like huckleberries. And so the bears are keen into what's ripe at the present time in their area. And also in the summer, you're going to have more insects available. So grubs, grasshoppers, things hatching and flying around in that warmer weather. As the summer turns to fall, more and more of that hard and soft mast is going to ripen. So you will have berries, you will have fruits and nuts. And these have very high nutritional values, and bears will find one of these food sources and just sit down and binge and eat until the food source is exhausted or until a better one becomes available. One fun fact about bears is that they have prehensile lips. So just like humans, they can shape and move their lips. And so they can pick berries one by one using their prehensile lips. Just a random fun fact. But it makes them eating machines, and they like to find those berry patches or like to find those acorns and just sit there and eat and eat and eat. So if you can find what's hot, you can find the bears. And I think that's the lesson of all of this when it comes to seasonality, is that even though bears can eat a number of different foods, not all of them are going to be available at the exact same time. And so you need to key in on what is available at the time you're hunting. And that's where you are going to find the bears. This is why chasing the snow line is so useful. Oftentimes, you'll hear bear hunters talk about finding the snow line to find the bears. And the snow line dictates what plants are going to be sprouting and blooming throughout the season. So early in the spring, when the snow is still heavy in the mountains and the snow line is pretty low, there's not going to be any food for the bears above that snow line under the layer of snow. But down below it, where the snow's melted, that will all be watered from the snow and it may be getting some sun. And so you can go check down below it for fresh, succulent grasses and plants. And that's where the bears are going to be. And then as the snow line melts throughout the year, it exposes more and more area that plants can grow and sprout and bloom, and the bears can then access those food sources as well. But remember, the bears are always going to prioritize those easy to digest foods with the highest nutritional content. So once the snow line has receded up the mountain a ways, and the plants have sprouted and grown, at some point, the plants lower down on the mountain will become less palatable to the bears because they've matured, or maybe if they're grasses, they've dried out. And so the bears will follow the food source up the mountain, trying to follow that new growth, which is especially palatable for them. So when you're out looking for bears, if you find the snow line, you want to look something like 500 to 1,500 feet in elevation below the snow line, below an actively melting snow line. And in this elevation band, you're most likely to find green grass and young plants that the bears will target. All right, so now you know some specific examples of what bears like to eat and better understand the seasonality of their diets. Really, I think it's more important to understand sort of the categories of what they eat so that you can look out for them. While it is helpful to know that they like dandelions, for example, or it is helpful to know that they'll eat termites, I think on a broader level, while you're out and about, just keeping an eye out for young succulent plants or blooming wildflowers or bugs and larvae is going to help you key in on the natural food sources that are available, even if you can't name the specific plants. So now you know what to look out for, but how do you find places that could potentially hold these food sources? There's a couple different areas to look out for. So one of the most common areas for these food sources, like young succulent plants, are going to be south-facing slopes. South-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere get more sun than north-facing slopes, and so they're likely to have less snow on them, they'll green up sooner, and they can provide lots of food for bears, especially in that early season. Another place to look is around avalanche chutes and rock slides. In these areas, the snow will melt off first, or it will slide away, and they're often very exposed. And these areas can green up a little bit sooner than the areas around the rock slide. And there's also lots of opportunities to find insects under the rocks, ground squirrels in the rocks, and there's lots of places for bears to den up when they're not out and feeding. So rock slides and avalanche chutes can be a great place to find some of these food sources for bears. You also might look at clear cuts and burns. Clear cuts remove the canopy of the forest, and burns as well. Remove the canopy of the forest so that sunlight can get to the lower levels. And this allows all sorts of plants to spring up. So clear cuts and burns, especially those that are about 3 to 7 years old, even older than that, can be really productive because they're spots where all of a sudden new life has been infused into the forest. And they can provide lots of food in areas where food otherwise may be somewhat scarce. Old logging roads are also a great place to look. You can think of logging roads as just long, skinny clear cuts. They also open up the forest canopy. And sometimes when logging roads are closed off, the loggers will actually plant grass on them to help the slope stay stable and prevent erosion. So logging roads can be a great place to find lots of green grass, and it's kind of a twofold advantage for bears because they can travel easily on these logging roads and they can also eat the whole way. So walking logging roads can be very productive if you're in an elevation zone and on a slope aspect that has lots of green grass in an area where maybe there's not a lot of green grass available. And finally, you might find food sources for bears in areas where there are lots of deer or elk present, because in these areas, they could be dropping calves, and those calves and fawns could be a good food source for bears. So you're kind of looking for their spring range. You're looking for a density of animals. If you actually see calves or fawns, that's great. And also, an abundance of elk or deer may indicate a fresh vegetation food source. So that's another way that finding elk or deer may help you find food sources for bears as well. Now, let's say you've identified an area that could have food for bears, and now you want to know if bears are actually there. At this point, it's helpful to be able to read bear sign. And this is just anything that indicates that a bear was actually in the area. So if you're in an area with lots of logs, you might look for ripped up trees or stumps where the bears are trying to get into them to get at the insects in them. In a avalanche chute or rock slide, you might look for turned over rocks where the bears are trying to get underneath for insects. You might look for dug up areas in wildflowers. And you should especially look for scat or poop. Scat can tell you a lot about what a bear has been eating. Like we talked about, because of their inefficient digestive system, often their poop will show you exactly what they've been eating because they just haven't digested the food all the way. So if they've been eating grass, it will be very apparent, and green if it's fresh, black if it's not so fresh, but it will be apparent that the bear's poop is made up of grass. If they've been eating berries, you'll see lots of seeds and even whole berries in the bear's poop. If they've been eating insects, you'll find all sorts of little insect parts in their poop. So finding bear poop is very valuable. And if you're finding fresh piles of poop, that's even more valuable because you know a bear was recently in the area. I have kind of a funny story about scat. A long time ago, I was backpacking on the Pacific Crest Trail, and it was maybe in July, and our group was talking about bears, and we knew bears were in the area, but we hadn't seen any. And at some point, we took a break along the trail, and it was a dusty trail, and I just got the idea in my head that I was going to draw a bear track and then trick everybody into thinking that a bear had come through. I don't know. I must have been bored, but I bent down to draw a bear track in the dust, and I start drawing the pad. I didn't really know what a bear track looked like at the time, but I started drawing, And just to the side of where I started to draw, I look over and I see an actual bear track right there. And there's just a paw print right there in the dust. And so I stop and I look at it. And then I grab one of the people in my group and I'm like, hey, is this an actual bear track? Someone who knew what they looked like. And he looked at it, and sure enough, it was a bear track. So that was cool to see. We continue on our way, and soon we happen upon a pile of poop. And in this pile of poop, there were lots of little red berries and seeds. So we could tell that the bear that we were following now had been eating all these berries. I can't remember what type of berries, but it was kind of funny. I found the bear sign when I was just trying to prank people. And I actually often find bear sign, it seems, when I'm not expecting to. So twice last season, I went out scouting and looking for bears in places I was pretty certain bears would be. And once I had climbed up this ridge, I had sat in an area glassing all morning, and then I was just on the move looking for sign, and I had walked through meadows with green grass. I had looked over some old logging cuts, and I just wasn't finding any bears, and I hadn't seen any sign. So I finally stopped to take a break and just take it all in, eat some food. And right after that, I get up and kind of walk in a little half circle around the area I was in. And there I found some old elk carcasses and a big old pile of bear poop. And I couldn't tell if it was from earlier in the spring or if it was from last fall. It did look pretty dried out, but at least I found some sign that bears did, in fact, exist in this area. I had another experience later that spring where I was hiking into an area where I had seen a bear earlier in the spring, just with my spotting scope. So I was hiking in, and I hiked something like 4 miles in along this river, along this trail that nobody else had been hiking into. The trail was washed out in some places. And so I was pretty confident that nobody else had been back there. And I got way back there and I just didn't find any bear sign along the trail. And I was thinking, I mean, I know I saw a bear back here, but I'm surprised that I haven't seen more sign back here by now. So again, I stop, I eat lunch, and right after that, I get up and kind of walk around in the area that I'm at. And there's a giant pile of wet bear poop right in the area that I was sitting in. And it was all green, so the bear had been feeding on grass. And it had been raining that day, so I couldn't tell quite how fresh it was, but it was definitely more fresh than the pile I found on those old elk carcasses. So I don't know why it is. For some reason, I seem to find bear scat when I'm not looking for it. Maybe I'm not looking hard enough. I don't know. But it's always encouraging to find that bear scat and know exactly what they've been eating. All right, so we've covered food pretty well. Before we wrap up, though, we need to touch on water. Water is a necessity for bears. Whether it comes from a spring, a seep, a creek, a river, bears are going to be in the vicinity of water pretty much at all times. They drink water, they swim in water and cool down, and water drives a lot of the growth that bears need, a lot of the vegetation growth that bears need to survive. So if you're in an area and you're looking for bears, you should definitely look in areas that are close to water, whether that's a big drainage or even if it's just a small spring or seep. Water is going to dictate where the bears are. All right, everyone. I hope this podcast has been helpful for you. I've always found it a little bit frustrating how people would say, find the food, find the bears, but then not give a very good explanation of what bears even eat. So I hope this has cleared that up for you a little bit, and it's also been a good research project for myself. One thing that comes to mind as I wrap this up is that different regions are going to have significantly different food sources, right? Big black bears in Pennsylvania might be gorging themselves on acorns in the fall, while a mountain bear in Idaho doesn't even know what an acorn is. So you'll have to familiarize yourself with the food sources available in your specific area, and that might require a little more research. It might be time to order a field guide or get on the internet and start figuring out what the plants around you even are. But with the information we covered today, at least you'll know what to look out for and you can start connecting the dots. Once you start finding the right food, you're likely to start finding the bears. So I think that's all for today. If any of you have great hunting experiences this spring, I'd love to hear about them. Just shoot me an email at persistenceoutdoors2022@gmail.com and maybe I'll share them on the show if you're interested. In the meantime, get out and hunt, and I'll catch you next week.